Please state your name for the record.
My name is Jules Sebastian.
Mr. Sebastian, what do you do for a living?
I work as the lead forensic investigator for Breckenridge County Midlands.
Well, what does this position entail?
Well, in layman's terms, I'm a sort of detective. It's my job to go to the scene of any potential crime, gather evidence, and then try to piece together a narrative of events for what must have taken place at that scene.
What sort of education qualifies you for this position?
Well, I earned my bachelor's degree in criminology from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. I then earned my master's degree in forensic science from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And I also graduated from the Midland State Police Academy, second in my class.
Well, Mr. Sebastian, how does this all involve you in today's case?
Well, I became involved in this case on August 18th of 2010 when I received a phone call from Officer Dale Williams. And this phone call took place at around 10:06 a.m. And Officer Williams informed me that there was a potential shooting at 23 Maple Street in Fairview, Midlands. So I made my way to that address to begin my investigation.
When you did this investigation, did you have sufficient facts and data?
Yes, I did. I collected a handgun at the scene. I examined the body of Sydney Park, and I collected all the other evidence and information that I needed to begin my investigation.
What sort of principles and methods did you use in this investigation?
I employed a variety of forensic techniques, including ballistics testing, GSR testing, and fingerprint testing.
Are these principles and methods standard in your field?
These are the most up-to-date forensic techniques in the field. They are not only standard and relied on, they are in fact required in situations such as these.
All right, Mr. Sebastian, let's take a step back now. Let's focus on the first testing you mentioned, this GSR testing. Could you explain the basis of what GSR is?
Certainly. GSR stands for Gunshot Residue Primer. I suppose the P is silent. You can think of GSR sort of as used gunshot powder. Now you see, when a weapon is discharged, GSR comes out the front and the back of the weapon, and it disperses out somewhat like glitter, and it leaves patterns on the user's hand and arm and body. Now, we use these GSR dispersal patterns to determine the location of the firearm relative to the shooter at the time of discharge.
Mr. Sebastian, in this investigation specifically, why did you test for GSR?
Two reasons. Clearly, I needed to find out who fired the weapon. And I also needed to know where precisely in the house the shooting took place.
How did you test for this GSR?
I followed standard protocol. I swabbed the hands of Terry Chapin, Andy Park, Sydney Park, and Jesse Duran. And I also tested the clothes that Jesse Duran and Sydney Park were wearing on August 18th of 2010.
So what were the results of this test?
The results were very telling. I found an extensive amount of GSR on Jesse Duran, which led me to believe that he fired the weapon with his right arm fully or nearly fully extended.
Well, let's take a step back. Could you explain to us how you know the right arm is fully extended?
Of course, I actually brought a demonstrative to show you exactly what I mean.
Commissioner Bush, opposing counsel, with the witness demonstrative.
Sure.
And may I approach the bench, or the jury box for courtesy copy?
Is this something that has been admitted, or?
No, Your Honor, it's simply for demonstrative purposes.
Okay, yes.
And may I approach the bench? And the witness. Mr. Sebastian, could you tell us what we're all looking at here?
Yes, what this is a representation of what a GSR dispersal looks like on a person who has fired a weapon in their right hand with their right arm fully or nearly fully extended.
Could you explain to us how this applies to Jesse Duran?
This has everything to do with Jesse Duran because this is the same pattern of GSR that I found on Jesse Duran. Now, what we found was that there were 200 GSR particles on Jesse Duran's right hand, 75 particles on Jesse Duran's torso and stomach, and only 25 particles on his left hand.
Could you tell us exactly what this means?
Well, the different concentrations of GSR tell us where the gun was. Now, because there was so much more GSR on Jesse Duran's right hand as compared to his torso and left side, that tells us that the gun was significantly closer. to Jesse Duran's right hand than it was to his center and left side, which in turn leads me to believe that Jesse Duran held the gun in his right hand and fired it with his right arm fully or nearly fully extended.
First, approach the witness to retrieve the demonstrative. Mr. Sebastian, when you did this investigation, you mentioned you used the GSR to figure out where exactly the incident took place. Did you ever find out where this took place?
Yes, I did. Based on the GSR that I found in the end table in the living room, I determined that the shooting took place in that living room.
And would you recognize a copy of that living room, the layout of the living room? I showed it to you.
Absolutely, I created that layout.
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with a demonstrative of the living room, constructive demonstrative.
Is defense attorney?
No, not yet.
And permission to approach the jury box for a courtesy copy,
Sure.
and the bench as well for a courtesy copy. Mr. Sebastian, could you just explain to us what I've handed you?
This is the layout of the Park home, which I created after my investigation.
And could you tell us how you use this diagram and the ballistics testing specifically you mentioned earlier?
Right, I used my ballistics testing to determine that Jesse Duran at the time of shooting would have been seated in this tan armchair, and Sidney Park would have been seated at the far edge of this couch right here.
Could you just explain to us how this ballistics testing is done?
Certainly. Now, simply what I did was take the gun that I found at the scene, and I test fired it at a forensic reconstruction of a human head at varying distances in order to best approximate the wound that I found on Sidney Park on August 18th of 2010.
So could you just recap how this ballistics testing played into your investigation?
Certainly. The wound on the forensic head that best approximated the wound I found on Sidney Park was the one that I fired from about 5 feet away. However, the gunpowder burns on the outside of Sidney Park's wound actually indicated to me that the gun was fired from 6 feet away, which is consistent with Jesse Duran, again, being in this armchair, and Sidney being in this couch, as they are 6 feet apart from each other.
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness to retrieve the demonstrative. Mr. Sebastian, earlier you mentioned that the third thing that you investigated was fingerprints. Could you explain to us how you found fingerprints?
Absolutely. The most relevant fingerprints were 2 partial prints that I found on the spent shell casing in the weapon.
Before we get into that spent shell casing, could you explain to us what a partial print is?
Yes. Now, when one is doing fingerprint analysis, what you're doing is trying to find individual points of similarity between a recovered print and a known print belonging to a known individual. Now, when we find 16 or more of those points of similarity, that is in the field considered to be a full or complete match. Anything less than that, anything less than 16 that is considered to be a partial print.
Mr. Sebastian, in your professional opinion, can partial prints be as conclusive or be as useful as complete prints?
Absolutely. What we use partial prints for is primarily to rule people out. Say, for example, that one individual has a 10-point match to a recovered print, and there are several other individuals who have no points of similarity at all to that print. Now, we can rule out everybody except for the individual with the 10-point match as not having touched that surface.
Now, could you go back and explain to us where you found these partial prints?
Yes, I found a 12-point match for Jesse Duran's right index finger and a 10-point match for Jesse Duran's right thumb on the shell casing approximately 180 degrees apart.
Mr. Sebastian, what does this mean?
Well, Jesse Duran was the only person who had any points of similarity to those prints. I completely ruled out Terry Chapin, Andy Park, and Sidney Park, and Lee Park. This really leaves Jesse Duran as the only realistic option for who could have loaded that weapon. This is further corroborated by the fact that finding the print 180 degrees apart like so is consistent with Jesse Duran gripping the bullet with his thumb and forefinger and loading the weapon like such.
After this investigation, was there any examination of Sidney Park's body?
Yes, there was an autopsy conducted by Dr. Havarilik that I was in attendance for.
Did this lead you to any relevant conclusions?
Yes. What stood out to me the most was the fact that the wound on Sydney Park was actually an oval-shaped wound. It was on her left, just above her left eyebrow. And the reason this stood out to me so much was because this tells me that at the time that the gun was fired, Sydney Park would have been rapidly turning her head towards the barrel at the time of firing, hence leaving an oblong, oval-shaped wound rather than a straight circular one.
Could you just briefly explain to us, after all this investigation, what your sequence of events was as an expert in the field?
At some points on August 18th of 2010, those two children gained access to a firearm. Jesse Duran loaded that firearm, and as Sydney Park had her back turned to him, he pointed the weapon at her head with his right arm fully
Objection,
extended.
Your Honor, lack of foundation. The witness just stated that Sydney Park had her back turned to Jesse Duran. We've heard no foundation for that.
Can I respond? Your Honor, this witness is giving his expert testimony as to what he believed happened as the sequence of events on August 18th. Now, it is up to the witness, based on his credentials, that the foundation has been laid for, to establish what his ultimate conclusions were as an expert. Therefore, we have laid the proper foundation to make mistakes.
What foundation have we heard to establish what position Sydney's body may have been?
Your Honor, this witness identified Sydney Park as not looking at Jesse the time of the shooting, because when the gun was fired, she was turning her head towards the gun. She was also sitting on the western edge of a couch, as he's already testified. This foundation lets him to conclude as to what he believes in his expert testimony, what happened on August 18th.
May I be heard, Your Honor? If the witness has found evidence that Sydney Park was turning her head at the time the gun was fired, then the witness may elicit that to the jury. But for him to say that her back was turned, we've heard no foundation for that.
I tend to agree. I think he can testify about what her head was doing. It seems that we do have some foundation as to what direction she may have been looking, but not necessarily what direction her body was facing. So if he can sort of narrow his testimony a little, I think we'll also stand the objection to that extent.
Motion to strike.
Great.
Mr. Sebastian, could you just explain to us the sequence of events pertaining to Jesse Duran specifically?
Yes, so Jesse Duran loaded the weapon, and he aimed it at Sydney Park's head with his right arm fully extended and pulled the trigger as Sydney rapidly turned her head towards him.
Thank you, Mr. Sebastian. I have nothing further.